Okay, everybody, welcome. You're the first of two Spanish American War things. And first, I'm going to start out here. As you can see right here, the four countries that were taken over by the United States as a result of the Spanish American War. We have Cuba, which is very, very close, 90 miles away or so from Florida, and Puerto Rico, which, as we know, had been in the news earlier. In the year about the terrible hurricanes and everything going there. Of course, Puerto Rico is still part of the United States. Then, of course, the Philippines, which obviously is its own country now. And, of course, Guam, which is also part of the United States still. Now, all of these countries here were controlled by Spain, and they were all given to the United States as a result of the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Spanish American War. All right, so how did all this start? How did the United States get drawn into it? Well, Cubans were obviously being occupied by Spain, and they didn't really like the terrible, terrible treatment that the Spanish were giving to the Cubans. They were looked at as second-class citizens. They were, being mistreated. They were being discriminated against. It was just not a pleasant situation for the Cubans. And eventually, they became sick of it and they started using guerrilla tactics. And that was really the only thing that was available to them because the Spanish troops were far better equipped and far better organized. But guerrilla tactics can be very, very difficult to counter. So the Spanish called in their one of their generals called Valeriano the Butcher Weiler. And anytime your nickname is the Butcher, that probably isn't a very good sign that you're going to be a kind, caring person. And he was called in to brutally put down the revolt. And when we say brutally, we see things literally like concentration camps, people being starved. Now, how much of this was 100% true? Well, we know for sure that there definitely was mistreatment. Was it really as bad as the American, in this case, the senators, we're seeing? Well, that's hard to say because the newspapers really just ran with the stories and, in many cases, exaggerated what was going on. And this, of course, was called yellow journalism. And it was in part responsible for U.S. entry in the Spanish American War. Part of it, perhaps, over exaggerating when it comes to how bad the Cubans were being treated. And part of it, of course, as we'll see when we get to other factors like the DeLome letter and, of course, the sinking of the USS Maine. But so far, we already see yellow journalism beginning to shape the opinions that the American people have on the Spanish. Another thing was the DeLome letter. Now, this was a letter sent from a Spanish government official, and it was sent to Cuba encouraging the Spanish to fight on, saying, "Hey, you guys go, don't give up. You're almost there. We can do it." All this sort of stuff. Somehow it was intercepted, and I mean, the stories we're not really exactly sure, and it was published on the front page of many prominent newspapers, yellow journalists and non. And what seems somewhat surprising, the letter greatly insulted President McKinley, and that caused tremendous anger. Can you imagine? I mean, nowadays it seems like politicians all they do is insult each other. And I guess this being a foreign uh, person insulting a foreign leader insulting our president, as you see, McKinley is a low politician, weak and catering to the rabble. Well, that was enough to really outrage the American public. They were pissed. You don't make fun of our president. Only we can do that. Well, things do get worse in Cuba. They continue to deteriorate. And as the situation continued, the United States said, "Hey, why don't we just send a battleship down there to Cuba, just in case, just to keep an eye on things?" And they sent down the USS Maine, which this is what our battleships looked like back in the late 1890s. And unfortunately, something bizarre happened to the Maine. It was late one evening, and people were about to go to bed, and there was a watch. It was just sitting there in Havana Harbor, and then all of a sudden, the Maine exploded under what people thought were very mysterious circumstances. At first, the Spanish were immediately blamed. And there was not really a lot of evidence. They claimed the Spanish were mining the harbor, or somehow they sabotaged, or it was really sort of unclear. It turns out in the end that in fact it was not a Spanish mine. It was actually an internal mistake. That apparently the ammunition storage was close to the engine room, too close, and a spark, and they blew up. And so it was not the Spanish. They were not at fault for that. But that didn't matter, because this was taken by the newspapers, particularly yellow journalism, and they came up with this phrase, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain." And the irony, of course, being that Spain probably didn't want to fight the Americans, but this was another factor, a huge factor. So far we have the mistreatment of the Cuban people. We also have the reports, probably yellow journalistic reports about the mistreatment of people. Of course, we said that, and then of course we have the USS Maine sending the General Whaler and the DeLone letter. So you have several things there that are going on already, and the U.S. still is not involved. Well, finally, after all these things sort of add up, the USA declares war. Now, although the war would turn into an easy victory for the United States, there were some difficulties. Very poor sanitation. Very, very poor sanitation. Um, Food was terrible. Now, remember, this is before the jungle, which we haven't really talked about too much, but the meatpacking industry and everything like that. But literally, they had to dump food out because it came out, rotten. They had canned meat, and they had all sorts of other canned products that were just terrible. And disease was rampant. And believe it or not, 5,462 U.S. troops died, but only 379 from combat. I mean, over 5,000 died because of terrible sanitation and disease and food. I mean, that is just terrible. Fortunately, things will start to get better, a little bit better in World War I, and then certainly much better in World War II in terms of sanitation. All right, that's it for today.